if you were to think that there is a ceasefire and a truce and negotiation coming, they're trying to grab as much real estate as they can. And it's troubling. But at this point, I think Trump knows he cannot believe Putin, whatever Putin says to him directly. So I think there's a sense to that. And maybe that's where the frustration is happening between the two.
Yeah, and I think, of course, there's some additional frustration because at least from the Russian side, they're claiming that the Easter truce was violated many times by the Ukraine side. The energy thing, really, both sides are saying that each side didn't abide by it and that they did, et cetera. So there's no trust on either side, which complicates the matter further. And then when you take a look at the issue with the balance of power, which you've already identified is clearly on the Russian side, especially in manpower. Here's what Sergei Lavrov is saying about that same ceasefire.
The leaders of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, and other representatives are now saying that Russia must unconditionally agree to a ceasefire solely because they are suffering defeats on the battlefield, and their plans to inflict a strategic defeat on the Russian Federation will never materialize. Everyone already understands this perfectly well. Our proposal, as voiced by President Putin, is the start of direct negotiations without preconditions. A ceasefire in this situation is seen as a preliminary condition that will be exploited to further prop up the Kyiv regime and strengthen its military capabilities.
So when you have the Russian side saying, we have the manpower issue, we have the industrial capacity, we have the ammunition and all that other kind of stuff, so we don't have to agree to a ceasefire. We want to get straight to the end of negotiations. And then they basically want to flip everything that you said the Ukraine side wants, which is we'll negotiate even in this lengthy process, all this stuff first. And then when that's agreed to, then we'll come to an end of ceasefire. Now, obviously, if you're for the Ukraine side or anybody who's from the Western side, they can hate that. They don't have to like it. But the fact is, we don't have either the leverage or the capacity to compel them to do anything different. Or I think we would already have done that. So what do you think that impasse does to where the war goes on the ground?
I think, first of all, I'm glad we're able to talk about this in this detail. And I'll tell you, one of the things as we were watching that segment that popped in my head is a good friend of mine that is on the ground right now, my teammate. And he says, if we look at it this way, if there was a ceasefire, it's almost like Putin sort of resigning and saying, I quit. And the reason for that is because, this invasion has perfectly or been executed. I wouldn't say perfectly been executed, but has been executed by Russia into Ukraine. So they're the attackers or the offensive nature here. So I believe that Putin would basically be saying, hey, I surrender if they did a ceasefire. Ukraine has been in a defensive mode for so many years in this conflict where we and everybody else that gave weapons would allow them to attack Russia. So it is really interesting about saying, hey, we don't want a ceasefire because, Kyiv and Ukraine is going to build up and it's going to help them better. Honestly, it's not going to. It would actually help Russia significantly better if they did do a ceasefire. But at the same time, the longer this goes, the more real estate Russia gets. And right now, they have a significant amount of those natural resources. They have almost every one of their coal mines and everything. So Russia is really tracking and putting Ukraine in a bad situation. So I understand why they don't want a ceasefire. It's, again, to the benefit of Russia. But again, it doesn't get it to the point of stopping this war. Now, the only thing that I liked about it, the only thing I liked about that statement was negotiations between the two parties directly. That needs to occur. I agree. But again, anything like this benefits Russia for movement into the country if they don't stop the ceasefire or they don't go to the ceasefire. But at the same time, a ceasefire does not really help Putin. It makes him look like he's surrendering. So there's a lot of facets to this. It's political, it's the ego and image that Putin fights for, and it's also the real estate that Russia's going to grab. So I hope that sort of makes sense because there's a lot of complexities in that one statement there.
Yeah, there certainly is. And obviously, the side that has the most power and leverage is in the history of any kind of negotiation always gets to basically call the shots, because if they don't get what they want, they just keep going. Now, one of the other parts of that Lavrov mentioned there was, we want to get to the end of war negotiations. We want to start talking about those before we start talking about that. Well, he also said in that same conversation what he means when he says the root cause is.
Once again, we laid out in detail our fundamental approaches to resolving this conflict by addressing its root causes. These consist of the years-long attempts to expand NATO eastward, right up to Russia's borders, and to absorb Ukraine into the North Atlantic Alliance, thereby creating direct threats to our security along Russia's borders. I also emphasized the importance of ending the practice, adopted by the Kiev regime, of eradicating everything connected in any way to Russia and the Russian world, including language, culture, Russian language media, and the canonical Orthodox Church. Most participants of the meeting, when commenting on the Ukrainian situation, demonstrated growing understanding of our approaches. We will continue this work.
He also said, I think it was on Monday, it was reported in a Brazil newspaper when he was there for a BRICS meeting, that he said they laid out their conditions, and the two of the ones that I think are the most painful and may even be impossible for Ukraine to even agree to if they wanted to, and that is demilitarization and denazification, as Russia defines them. And they said, if we don't get that, we're going to continue fighting. Do you see any possibility, since you have some knowledge on the ground, that Ukraine would ever agree to a denazification according to Russian definitions and a demilitarization, which they said is somewhere around 100,000 total troops in their armed forces?
Great. I'm first of all, I'm glad you showed that statement, because I do want to talk about that denazification statement. So first of all is to demilitarize Ukraine. I don't see that happening, and honestly, that would be very dangerous for Ukraine in general, because of what we saw with Russia. So I don't see that. The idea of saying you're not going to belong to NATO, honestly, there's not a problem with that, because the rest of Russia is surrounded by NATO. So it's one of the things that I think I was uncomfortable with, and I think many people are comfortable with them belonging to NATO, but belonging to the EU. So that economically is good for them. The other thing is they don't want Zelensky in power anymore, and frankly, that's up to an election, so that's to be determined. But I'll tell you, the demilitarization of Ukraine, that ain't going to happen. I don't see anybody going to that. But the denazification thing, really glad it came up, because this is something that existed, and I hope people don't take sound bites out of this, but it's true, is for many years on the border, the Azov, which was very extreme, they were the monsters you needed, because they were the only ones that stepped up to fight Russia in Crimea. But they're the monsters you don't like to have around, if that makes sense, those type of military
I get
types.
it.
And they were the ones that were very extreme. And unfortunately, they wrote certain Nazi symbols on their craft and everything. And what they did want is, that line is very blended between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of families on back and forth. It's always been that. They did influence and institute where you're not going to speak Russian. You're not going to have the Russian culture and everything on that border. That is true. And a lot of people didn't know that. Now, that was one of the things that Russia didn't like. And that's where they started amassing troops. Now, was that a reason to invade Ukraine? No. But yes, that did exist, and that was one of the issues. And we saw Zelensky not really doing much about it. That's one of the triggers that a lot of people don't know historically, that Russia wasn't happy with. The idea of NATO, you know what? They could be upset about that, since, everything went after the Berlin Wall fell. They're still pissed off at that. But at the same time, the denazification, yes, that really did occur, but that was not really a basis for Russia to invade. But unfortunately, that's one of the negative attributes that Ukraine did have in the beginning. And people need to understand that that's what one of the triggers were.
Yeah, and so that leads us to the position to where, and again, we circle back to the beginning. The Trump administration says, I want the two sides to come together, but the Ukraine side is like, yeah, we're not going to do the demilitarization. And the Russian side says, yeah, we're not going to do an unconditional ceasefire. So there's just a block there that they're not going to get any closer to. And I guess we have to just be honest and say, if Trump wanted to mediate something and he sees the two sides being irreconcilable on this point, then there really isn't a lot of room for him to continue trying.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, from the negotiation standpoint, absolutely. Now let's throw in this minerals deal, because that's where we start seeing a little bit of a twist. With the minerals deal, okay, it is beneficial for both Ukraine and for us, because it's a 50-50 split. It's not like it was before, where we're going to get paid for past war, military equipment, and I get it. But the same point is, when we do that, when that deal was signed, that is the first part that's indicating
Oh, we seem to
we
have gone blank.
have the United States being involved in the entire electrical grid and system is required for heavy mining. And for that to occur, the US has to build it up. So that's one of our parts. Anytime with US involvement, equipment, etc., with US personnel, we're going to have to protect it. And that's an indicator to, keep Russia out of it. So I believe that that's going to be a good thing. It's the first US involvement in country. It's the first sort of deterrence that Russia has to face with not attacking, but that's going to take a long time. So with the US involvement in that, I think that's beneficial to pushing towards peace. But man, that's going to take a long time before all that stuff starts occurring.
Yeah, and here's the problem. I don't know that there is a lot of time, and time is definitely not on the Ukraine side here. I want to play just a real short piece from Weeb Union today, who's one of the guys who's been tracking the war from the beginning. And really has over time has been proven to be really accurate in terms of how he assesses where the front lines are, et cetera. Here's what he said earlier today about the status on the front lines.
There are several developments across the front line. In one of the larger updates this year, the Russians have managed to advance several areas across the eastern section of the front line. Within the Donetsk region itself, they've advanced about 20 plus square kilometers, but they also managed to advance within the Sumy region in the north.
And of course, that Sumy region it looks like that Russia's about ready to put even more pressure up there. They're moving further south. It was, I think, day before yesterday where Russia had reclaimed 29 square kilometers. So this is not like just inching up every day. There seems to be taking bigger and bigger chunks around the front line. So if this continues on, and if the U.S. backs out of its mediating effort, how does that slow down? Because at some point, the Ukraine is going to be facing not a bad negotiation, but a military defeat.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're getting to the truth of this. I mean, you mentioned it a little while ago about how portable Ukraine was a couple of years ago, and they did. They pushed them back, and they should have put a ceasefire and stuff then. But right now, the Russians forces are pushing further and further and further into Ukraine, and that is one of the problems because, again, as they do that, the last coal mine, which they use for all the mining and everything, is about to be lost. And at that point, most of those natural resources that are rather significant are controlled by Russia. So honestly, Russia can't handle the entire country of Ukraine. But what we do see is that Russia and Putin wants to go at least to Kyiv and take from Kyiv completely east and take that as their own ownership. Honestly, it seems like that's the objective. And unfortunately, we saw the lines barely move, almost like World War I for a long time. Now, unfortunately, because of all the killing, and now you have North Koreans coming in and Chinese coming in, you're starting to see Russia move further and further into Ukraine. A big tactical mistake was when Ukraine went into Kursk. Now, I think they were trying to draw the Russians north, but unfortunately, they didn't have the supply chain. The Ukrainians didn't have the supply chain or the manpower to hold Kursk. I don't quite understand why they did that as far as materially or militarily planning, but that was one of their downfalls, and Kursk was lost. So again, tactfully, strategically focused and trying to do the combined arms as far as joint work with the Ukrainian military, it's just not there. And unfortunately, as we see it each and every day, Russia is increasing its military force and presence on the east. And I'll tell you one thing this is one of the reasons why I went over there on the humanitarian side, is if Russia was to take Odessa, that would be a huge problem because all the ports are lost, and the only two entries into Ukraine is through Romania and Poland. And also, you can't forget, is in Moldova and Transnistria, there's about 25,000 Russian troops sitting there, and that's way in the west. So this could fall rather significantly and not too far in the future. So there's a lot more at stake that a lot of people aren't thinking about from a warfare and from a planning perspective.
That's a great point. Great point that too few seem to be willing to recognize. Let me ask you another question that you may be in a better position to answer than nearly anybody. What would happen on the Ukraine side? Let's say that say next week, and it literally could be that soon, the Trump administration says, all right, we're not meeting, but we're out now. That these guys aren't going to bridge the gap, we're out. So good luck to Ukraine, to Europe. If y'all want to keep fighting this, that's up to you. But now it's between y'all, and we're not playing anymore. Now, there hasn't been any new aid other than this curious $50 million package that the administration put the other day, which is minuscule and doesn't really make any difference on anything. But if we don't even do those kinds of things anymore and back out, what impact psychologically, morally, will this have on the defenders within Ukraine if they know that U.S. is no longer even nominally having their military back?
Yeah, I think militarily, as far as the folks that are fighting in the east, they've been sort of neutral to this because they're fighting and they're focused on just nothing to the fighting. But as far as the morale is going to be hit because they're going to be wondering, what am I going to get for beans and bullets from that point forward? What is going to be the support from the weaponry that we're going to have? I think the rest of the country is going to be more politically jaded and emotional about it. But as far as the war fighters they're fighting on, I think that's the biggest question. It is the biggest question is what the U.S. is going to do. Now, if the U.S. is just going to be providing intelligence and so forth like that, okay, that is beneficial. But the problem is that the rest of NATO or the European Union is not up to a military, as far as their industrial complex, to support Ukraine in this conflict. And it'd probably take 8 months or more for them to give them the amount of weapons, or at least try to get it to some kind of supply chain that was equal or close to the United States. That's where we don't know what the decision is from the Trump administration as far as what would the support be if we
Yep.
pulled out. That's where things really start tripping over, where Russia can really take and gain some real estate very quickly, and it's dangerous.
And what do you have any knowledge about some of the reports that we've seen? But they're spotty in that apparently there's already shortages on the front lines of ammunition for whether it's Bradleys or tanks or really any of these, even artillery shells, because the pipeline has shrunk so much from what it was at the end of the Biden administration that the Europe has not been able to offset that. They're already having shortages across the board. Is that accurate?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is. It's interesting is that let's get as simple as to each warfighter. The IFAKs, the individual first aid kits for trauma, the body armor and everything. They're shorter on that, and then you add on all this other artillery and everything. Absolutely. I mean, they have employed a lot of the weapons we've got, but they're not experts in it, so there's been a lot of waste. I'm not trying to criticize them. That's just a fact. But yeah, the numbers are dwindling, and that's where we have a problem. And again, their biggest thing, like I said, is if we flooded them with all the weapons that they need, it's still the people employing those weapons that they don't have. So, unfortunately, it doesn't matter if we give them everything, they're not going to have enough troops. I'm not trying to be negative about it, but it's just a
Yeah.
realistic
It's
sense
just you got to
as
be
far as the military
realistic,
engagement.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and let me ask you on the political and diplomatic front inside Kiev. What you have described there is stuff that we've been seeing for a long time. And again, if you take the emotion out of it and you just look at it as a military analysis, it's a pretty bleak picture. And it leads to one very clear conclusion that you either have an ugly negotiation where you get at least some leverage to make some kind of negotiations, or you may end up facing a complete military defeat where you got no choices on anything, to include a line that may be up on the Dnieper River. Do you see any possibility that the Zelensky government may say at some points, recognize, especially if the Trump administration says, all right, we've walked, that he may say, all right, now it's time to have a negotiated settlement and talk directly to Russia, because otherwise we're going to lose everything that we have up to the Dnieper? Do you see any chance of that?
Oh, that's a $1 million question. I mean, honestly, Zelensky and everything as far as fighting and protecting their country. I get it. But unfortunately, at this point, everything and all the cards are really held, like it or not, by Putin. And Putin's the invader, and he's a stronger invader. So if Putin wants to go all the way to Kyiv and says, I don't want a ceasefire, that could occur. And honestly, Putin, I don't think it cares if it's going to take 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, or 5 years. He's going to proceed. So there's going to have to be something. And unfortunately, if Kyiv is going to stop this war and negotiate with Russia, it's going to be 100% on their terms. And I hate to say it, but that seems to be the case. Because right now they had 20%, at least the Russians had 20% of the country, and they're gaining and gaining and gaining. And like I said, is how long is it going to take? Ukraine can't sustain the long game. And so denazification, sure, that's easy. Wipe out those problematic children on the Far East and make sure that doesn't occur. But demilitarizing, dangerous, which gives Russia complete carte blanche to go as far as they want into Ukraine. So yeah, I don't see how that's going to play out where Kyiv was basically going to capitulate. The only thing I can see is that they would say, okay, take everything you've got right now, let's stop the war, and that's it. And that's if Russia wants to take that. So I hate to say it, but it's in Russia's court to decide if they want to stop fighting or if they want to continue all the way to Kyiv, even if it takes 5 years.
Yeah, and I guess we'll find out maybe even as soon as next week if that's where the administration is going. One last question I have on this topic before I want to shift gears in the last few minutes we have,
Sure.
but that is on something that Budanov said or was quoted as saying about 6 or 7 weeks ago, that he said that our forces probably would be hard pressed to continue providing actual cohesive defense up till maybe June or July, if in the middle of the summer. So if we don't get some major changes, we may not be able to continue to provide resistance. First of all, do you know if he actually said that? And second, whether he did or not, is that your assessment?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if he said it or not. I didn't hear it directly, so I'm not sure on that. But I'll tell you is that when right now it's the sort of what they say, the land of no roads. They have a term for it, but that's where the thaw starts from the winter and everything's just muddy. But actually, it wasn't really a brutal winter, so things are drying up quickly. So when that happens, that's where you usually see the big push. You see everybody just pushing forward in these big offensives. The last one, Ukraine didn't really have a big one. This one, we see Russia picking it up significantly with the attacks, and I think Russia's going to have a huge offensive as soon as the weather starts getting warm and drying out. To be able to stop that is going to be very problematic and troublesome for Ukraine. So I see Russia getting even more of a land grab here as soon as the summer warms up.